You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. This week, we finally start talking about what most people think of when they talk about Exodus. That is the 10 plagues. Or, as we said last week, actually the 10 signs. This is a very complex and challenging set of chapters. In fact, I would argue it's one of the most challenging and complex set of chapters in all of Exodus, and possibly in the Bible as a whole. If you grew up in Sunday school, you probably heard this as something along the lines of, God did 10 bad things to Egypt so they would let Israel go. But that's kind of like saying Star Wars is about Luke Skywalker versus Darth Vader. That's kind of true, but it's just a very small part of the story, and you're missing like a dozen different layers of profound commentary and complexity when you simplify it to that level. What we're going to be getting into for much of the rest of this series now is not comfortable material, and it shouldn't be. This is not going to be the children's church flannel graph version that you may have heard when you were younger. Or perhaps that you've even heard in church recently. If the Bible was subject to the Motion Picture Association rating system, this part would get a hard R. And I'm going to do my best to make sure we remember that as we go through these familiar stories. But that being said, this is also not about some vengeful deity throwing cosmic temper tantrums. These stories are about liberation, and sometimes liberation looks like disaster to those who have built their world on the backs of the oppressed. So let's finish up Exodus chapter 7 and talk about when God drew first blood. Before we even get into reading any verses from this chapter today, I want to draw your attention to an aspect of the 10 signs that I doubt you've heard about in church, because I never did. And it's that the 10 signs are very purposefully structured, and there are multiple ways that we can turn the diamond and see the different facets of how these 10 signs are arranged. Naturally, we just tend to read them in chronological order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But there are at least 3 or 4 main ways that Bible scholars have looked at these signs and noticed a very deliberate structuring that points to an incredible amount of skill on the part of the biblical authors. Last week, I pointed to the article on the Torah.com, Why Pharaoh Went to the Nile, and I'm going to draw on that again this week because it has some really fascinating notes on ways that we can group together these signs and see different angles of it, different aspects. It brings out different facets that we may not notice if we're just reading chronologically. First, you can read them in sets of 2. Remember, we have 10 plagues, 10 signs, so you can do the first 2, the second 2, third 2, fourth 2, and fifth 2. Here's what Nogel is getting at in that article. He writes, the first structure groups the plagues 2 by 2, and he uses that language to make you think of what? Noah's Ark with the animal 2 by 2. So he says the first 2 signs involve the Nile, blood and frogs. They both happen at the Nile. The second both involve insects, lice and swarms. The third involves illnesses, anthrax and boils. The fourth ruins the crops, hail and locusts. And the fifth entails darkness, 3 days of darkness, and the firstborn die at midnight. So already we're seeing a very orderly structure to this. Then Nogel goes on with a second possible way you can structure these together. He says that they also follow a tripartite structure of 3 plagues each, plus 1 at the end, the 10th. The first plague in each of these stories, so the first, fourth, and seventh, remember we're grouping them in triads, so we're going with the first in each triad, the first, fourth, and seventh, contain Yahweh's commandment to Moses to station himself before Pharaoh, each time employing the Hebrew root natsav, for to station, to stand before Pharaoh. So the first of the signs in each triad has Moses right before Pharaoh. Then he says each also contains the phrase, in the morning. And the second plague in each series, so the second, fifth, and eighth plagues, employ the command, go to Pharaoh. All right, fascinating. Moreover, within each of these three sets, Yahweh issues a warning for the first and second plagues, but not for the third. So for the first, second, fourth, fifth, seventh, and eighth plagues, God gives a warning of what's about to happen. But for the third, sixth, and ninth, he doesn't. Nogel continues. Finally, Aaron serves as an agent during the first set of three plagues, whereas Moses performs the final three. I realize some people are visual learners, so it may be a little difficult to follow along with this verbally. So I will link to this article again in this week's show notes so you can have this right up in front of you and read it for yourself as well. It might help solidify some of this. But hopefully you're seeing how impressive the literary structure of this is. Like, I remember being in, I don't know, it was probably middle school, and you had to write out certain forms of poetry. One in particular that I remember with great disdain was having to write a haiku, which is very heavily structured. Like, you have to have every syllable accounted for. And I really remember struggling to come up with something so concise and well-structured. That probably doesn't surprise any of you listening to this, right? That I struggled to be concise even as a child. But I mean, the amount of work that had to go into something as simple as a few lines of a poem just makes me so in awe of the biblical authors' writing abilities and how they wove in all of these different patterns that take so many rereadings of the text to catch. And I've been reading the Exodus story since I could read. I remember multiple times learning about it in Sunday school and junior church and youth group and Bible college, and yet I didn't see these things until I read more scholarly works where people were explaining this. And I can't believe how easy it is to miss some of this, but it's right there. And it's so cool once you notice it. It's addicting when you realize the level of complexity that is written into these biblical stories. Once you realize it's there, you can't get enough. You keep looking for it. So let's go through a couple more of these possible ways that you can read the 10 signs to see a couple more of these structures. Going back to Nogel's article, he says the third structure operative in the account is concentric. It divides the plagues into two sets of 5 that reflect upon each other chiastically. We've talked about chiasms before here. It's where you have parallelism happening across multiple lines. So the simplest form would be having 4 lines of text, the first line, the second line, the third line, the fourth line, the first and fourth line up, and the second and third line up. So he's saying that you can read the plagues, the 10 signs, in a similar fashion. Here's how he explains it. The first and 10th both contain introductory and closing formulas, and he's implying that that is not present in the others. The second and 9th refer to the hardening of the heart both at the beginning and end of the sign, and they introduce a specific request. The third and 8th contain a prophetic formula and specific requests to serve Yahweh. In the 4th and 7th, the opening formula contains a command to Moses for Aaron. The 5th and 10th both feature a prophetic formula and a specific request to serve Yahweh. That one's a little complex, but it is there. Let's look real fast at the 4th structure he suggests. This employs, he writes, a biblical literary device that underscores the importance of the 7th and 10th items in rosters of 10. In this case, the 10th plague serves as the obvious climax for the entire narrative. It kills all the firstborn Egyptian males, including Pharaoh's heir, as a lex talionis response to the king's decree to kill all firstborn Israelite boys. I'm going to pause there for just a second. Lex talionis is a Latin phrase for a legal term that is used even today, but it actually predates the Bible into ancient Mesopotamian cultures. It basically means a law of retaliation. So the way that most people see this is like an eye for an eye sort of thing. You take something from me, I get to take something from you. So if you take an eye from me, I get to take out your eye. If you take $100 from me, I get $100 back from you. However, there's a second side of it that would probably have been the focus in the ancient Near East, and we have flipped it in more modern times. The lex talionis doesn't just mean I take something from you if you take something from me. It sets a limit on that. So the idea of eye for eye, and this is something we should get into when we actually get to that passage in the Bible, but it's not just I can take your eye if you take my eye, but rather that I can't take more than your eye if you took my eye. We kind of have a tendency as human beings to up the ante and to take more than our pound of flesh. Just think of any gangster TV show or movie where somebody gets stabbed in, I don't know, the arm or leg, and then they stab that guy in the heart. That is escalating the issue. Lex Talionis isn't just you stabbed me so I can stab you. It's I can't stab you somewhere you didn't stab me. So if you stab me in the leg, I can't go and stab you in the heart and make matters worse. So it's also setting a limit here. I bring up that whole rabbit trail because Nogel revealed a cruel irony in this text, and it is the Lex Talionis of the 10th sign in comparison with the beginning of Exodus. The firstborn in Egypt die because way back at the beginning of the book, under the previous Pharaoh, so many sons of Israel died in the Nile. We're going to see that theme pop up more than once in the next several weeks. Going back to Nogel, he's talking about the importance of the 7th and 10th items in a biblical list. So he writes that the 7th plague, hail and fire, ranks next in importance. It receives the most space other than the 10th, and it constitutes a manifestation of the divine presence. It was more severe than the previous plagues, and it was unprecedented in history. The plague of hail is also the first to force Pharaoh to repent. This will be in Exodus 9 when we get there. Moreover, unlike the first and third plagues, the narrator's announcement of the 7th plague omits the words, "Behold, he," that meaning Pharaoh, "goes out to the water." The change in formula suspends the reader's anticipation of water, which appears just a few verses later in the form of hail. End quote. There's actually a 5th way you can structure these as well that I forgot to mention earlier. And here I'm drawing from Carmen Imes' Bible Project classroom notes on Exodus. And there she is drawing on the work of scholar Terence Fretheim, who sees parallels between the signs here and the events that will happen with Israel once they get out of Egypt. And here are some examples of that. So in last week's episode, we talked about Moses' staff swallowing the Egyptian staffs. Well, in Exodus 15, when they're crossing the Red Sea, the Egyptians are swallowed by the sea. As we're going to have this week, the water of the Nile turning to blood, we'll have the Egyptian armies killed at the Red Sea, turning red with their blood. In the next chapter, we have frogs covering the land, just as the sea will cover the Egyptians in Exodus 15. Just as the dead frogs will pile up on the shore, so will the dead Egyptians pile up. Just as not one fly is said to remain in Egypt after the end of the 4th sign, so not one Egyptian is said to have remained from Pharaoh's army in chapter 14, verse 28. Just as the locusts are driven into the sea after the 8th plague, so the Egyptians are driven into the sea in chapters 14 and 15. But it continues past the sea crossing as well, because just as we're going to read this week that the Egyptians could not drink the water after this first sign, so the Israelites run into a situation where they will not be able to drink water in the desert. Just as there will be raining hail in a couple of chapters, there will be raining bread on Israel in the wilderness. Just as the locusts will soon come up and cover the land, so in chapter 16, the quail will come up and cover the land for Israel. So those are 5 different nerdy ways that you can pair up the 10 signs and see different comparisons and contrasts among them. I'll also point out here, before we actually get into reading the passage, that you have retellings of the Exodus account in both Psalm 78 and Psalm 105, and they actually list the plagues, the signs, in different order than how Exodus says that they happened. So make of that what you will, but I think those poetic retellings suggest to us that the order and the exact detail of them is less important than the message that they were trying to convey. And that's that these signs are not just divine random acts of violence. It's strategic resistance. God is not just opposing oppression here. He is systematically dismantling the structures that made it possible. And I think especially that last part that we talked about, of how some of this foreshadows future events, like the water turning to blood here and being undrinkable, comparing to Israel running into the bitter water at Marah, and yet God makes it sweet for them there. Egypt experiences deadly hail raining from the skies here, while Israel receives life-giving bread raining from the skies later on. Locusts devour Egypt's crops here, while quail cover the land later on as provision for Israel. It's the same God, it's the same power, it's basically the same actions, but completely different outcomes depending on whether you're perpetuating oppression or struggling for freedom. To me, that speaks into the very divided, polarizing situation that politics have right now, at least especially in America, where I am. Recently, my wife Jana and I have been going to the gym together a good bit, and they have a whole row of TVs hanging from the ceiling. And they have several different things on the TVs, of course, but they have a few different news stations. And without fail, at least one is always on Fox and another on CNN. And sometimes you can see them talking about the exact same news story happening at the exact same time, and yet they have completely different takes on it because of the bias that either channel has. We're all seeing the same events unfold in life. And because I grew up in very fundamentalist circles, but now have many friends who are in more progressive circles, I kind of get a foot in both worlds, and I get to see completely polar opposite reactions to the exact same event happen. I hear some friends celebrate when a particular event happens, and others mourn the same thing. I hear certain friends call a particular candidate or political leader God's judgment on our country, while others consider them to be God's blessing for us. And that just goes to show how much of life is perspective. As much as we like to believe that events as they happen are objective, the minute we perceive them, they become subjective to our understanding. That's just reality. We can't get around that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We all have biases. That's just the way life is. The question then becomes, which biases are you going to have? Which way are you going to lean? And part of the message of Exodus is that if you are on a side that is about amassing power and controlling the religious expression of people who believe differently from you, you're in the place of Pharaoh, not Israel. So the biblical text is giving us an opportunity here to take pause and consider whether we've become like Pharaoh in the story. We always like to read ourselves in the place of Israel. We naturally put ourselves in the hero's shoes. But that's not often the case. We tend to be like King David when Nathan the prophet came to him and gave him the whole spiel about the man in the kingdom that stole a sheep from a poor neighbor of his. And we tend to assume that we're the poor neighbor who was victimized instead of realizing that maybe what's about to hit us is a "thou art the man." So before we get any further, just take a minute and pause and consider which role in this story you've slipped into playing. Alright, time to read some verses. Pick up where we left off last week in verse 16. So I'm going to read that verse again just to get us a little bit of context for where we're going to be in verses 17 and following. God is speaking to Moses, and he says, "You will say to Pharaoh, Yahweh God of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. And look, until now you would not hear. So thus says Yahweh, In this you will know that I am Yahweh. Look, I will smite with the rod that is in my hand upon the waters which are in the river, and they will be turned to blood. And the fish that are in the river will die, and the river will stink, and the Egyptians will loathe to drink of the water of the river. And Yahweh spoke to Moses, Say to Aaron, Take your rod, and stretch out your hand upon the waters of Egypt, upon their streams, upon their rivers, and upon their ponds, and upon all their pools of water, that they may become blood, and that there will be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. And Moses and Aaron did so, as Yahweh commanded. And he lifted up the rod and smote the waters that were in the river in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants. And all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. And the fish that were in the river died, and the river stank. And the Egyptians couldn't drink the water of the river, and there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. We will stop there at verse 21. So this is it. The first of the 10 plagues, or 10 signs, as we noted that they are actually called in the Bible. Don't let the familiarity of this text dull you to the horror of it. Imagine how graphic this would be if you go out to the river one day and just suddenly see its bluish color turned to blood red. I want to pose a question here that is similar to what I asked back in chapter 4 when Moses was on Sinai with God. And that was when God gave him the signs of leprosy and the rod turning into the Nakash and all that. And I said, why? What is the purpose? If this is about Israel understanding that Yahweh spoke to Moses, what purpose do these signs serve? How do they prove that point? And we got into all that back in our episode for the second half of chapter 4. So let's ask that question again here. If the purpose of this sign, as God said here in verse 17, is that you will know that I am Yahweh, and he is speaking to Pharaoh there, how does this show his power, his presence, his identity? How does this prove anything? What is the point of turning water to blood? If there are a number of things, like an infinite possibility of what the first sign could have been, why blood? Why this? Well, I think there are 4 possible reasons, and I don't think it's something where we have to choose just one of them. I think they all play into God's reasoning for using this as the first sign. And they're all more sophisticated and theologically rich than we might at first expect. First, I would say it's because the Nile was a source of life to the Egyptians. This was water flowing right through their land. Much of Egypt was desert, but this provided a life-giving oasis wherever the water of the Nile went. And now, God took that symbol of life and turned it into a symbol of death. Well, at least partially, because blood can be both a symbol of life or death. The only difference being whether it's inside the body or outside the body. And in this case, it is a river running red with blood. It is a negative depiction of death that has taken over this symbol of life. Back in our Genesis 1 through 6 series, we talked about the incredible literary structure of each of the days of creation. Actually, very similar to how there are multiple ways you can structure and pair together the 10 signs, like we talked about at the start of this episode. You can do the same thing with the days of creation. And we talk about that all in that series if you haven't listened to it yet. Really fascinating stuff. Well, when we were talking about all that with creation, I pointed out that later on, the Bible will use the language of the first 3 chapters of Genesis dealing with creation and frequently invert it on its head to describe negative events that happen, anything from natural disasters to the exile, with this anti-creation language or de-creation language. And we find that the plagues, the 10 signs, are very much a de-creation of God's created order. So in stark contrast to how Genesis begins with God's taking the chaotic waters and bringing life out of them, now we have God's taking relatively ordered waters. The Nile was in between its banks. It stayed in a particular place. And he turns it chaotic by turning it into a symbol of death. Rather than bringing new life out of the water, he brings death into the water. It is an inversion of the creation story. The second reason I think God may have chosen to use this as the first sign pairs with Nogal's comments about Lex Talionis. Remember Exodus 1, when Pharaoh ordered every Hebrew baby boy thrown into the Nile? Well, imagine being a Hebrew parent, watching your newborn disappear beneath the surface of the Nile while Egyptian soldiers enforced this genocide. The river became a mass grave for innocent children. And now God takes that same river, the source of life for all of Egypt, and transforms it into a vivid reminder of that atrocity as it turns blood red. Every Egyptian who looked at the Nile would be forced to confront what their nation sanctioned. God is ensuring that the cost for governments that separate children from their parents cannot be ignored or forgotten. So here, God doesn't just remember the oppressed. He makes the oppressors unable to forget what they have done. The third reason I believe God used the bloody Nile as the first sign is to dismantle the religious infrastructure of Egypt. Ancient priests often had to bathe to maintain ritual cleanliness. No clean water means no purification ceremonies. And no purification ceremonies means that they can't serve their gods properly. If the religious rituals that legitimize Pharaoh's divine authority can't be performed, the whole system starts to fall apart. See, this isn't just about making life inconvenient for Egypt. It's about systematically exposing how the religious machinery that justifies oppression is actually quite fragile. As much as we have tried to separate politics and religion in America today, the simple reality is they really can't be separated. And for most of human history, they weren't. Because the ancients, and well, most people throughout human history, have believed that the gods influenced just about everything in life, it wasn't until very, very recently that humans separated politics and religion. And that is why bad politics almost always stem from misguided religion. We see this happen in medieval Christianity, where the church got power hungry and sanctioned the Crusades and Inquisition. We see it even more recently, less than 100 years ago, when many churches supported the rise of Adolf Hitler in World War II Germany. And we even see it today. Try as we might, politics and religion really can't ever be separated as much as we would like for them to be. So the question then for us just becomes, will we allow our religious beliefs to become liturgies of empire, like Egypt in this story, or will we channel our religious beliefs to be in line with the God who liberates the hurting? Fourth reason I believe God turned the Nile to blood for this first sign is mythological subversion. This is where it gets really sophisticated. Because while we associate the story of the Nile turning to blood with this biblical account in Exodus, it's actually not original to the Bible. There are at least 3 major Egyptian myths that talk about the Nile turning to blood. One that is definitely written after this biblical story would have happened. One that could be roughly around the time that this would have happened, depending on when you date the Exodus. And one that is absolutely 100% predating the Exodus account. And I don't just mean when this was written down or when this was edited in the Bible. I mean before this could have even happened. So let's take a quick look at those. The first one is sometimes called the Demon of Bastet. And here I'll be quoting from Nogel's article on thetorah.com, The Egyptian Magicians. So I'll link to that again this week as well. With the Demon of Bastet, he says, is a ritual text that identifies one of 7 demons of the goddess Bastet, here a manifestation of the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet. And he quotes this ancient text as saying that she is the one who is in the Nile flood who makes blood. And then he points to Thomas Schneider, who he says observes that this could be understood as a demon who creates carnage in the Nile and thus turns the Nile into blood. And as far as we can tell, this story comes from roughly around 925 to 890 BCE. So regardless of when you date the Exodus, be that early, late, or whenever, this little snippet we have from this ancient ritualistic text about a demon who can turn the Nile into blood is definitely from after the time that the Exodus would have happened. Now, as we've talked about before, the biblical stories did not just drop out of the sky in their finished form. They came from oral histories and different written down traditions that eventually got compiled together and edited together into the form that we know today. Likewise, with other ancient mythologies, it is quite possible that this one predated in some other form the version that we have found in text from around 900-ish BCE. But as far as we know, it would have postdated when the Exodus happened. But there's another story, and this one comes from the wonderfully titled Book of the Heavenly Cow. Yes, that is real. You can absolutely look it up. And this would have been written down somewhere around the 1300s BCE. So if you take a little bit of a later date for the Exodus, this could possibly predate when the Exodus happened. Returning to Nogel's notes on it. He writes that the Egyptians had a story called the Cataclysm of Ra, in which Ra's daughter, the goddess Hathor, was called on to punish humanity for not worshipping Ra like they were supposed to. So she decided to wipe out all of humanity. But Ra didn't like that, because he still wanted people to rule. So with the help of his faithful followers, Ra arranged for large quantities of beer to be mixed with red dye or pomegranate juice so that it would look like blood. Then they brought 7,000 jars of beer and poured the contents on the fields, flooding the fields where Hathor would return to continue her slaughter. The next day, when Hathor returned to eliminate the rest of humanity, she saw the large pool of blood. She started drinking from it until she became so drunk that she couldn't remember why she was sent there. And when she returned to her father, Nun, she slept for many days. As a result of this myth, during the festivals of Hathor and Sekhmet, people would drink beer blended with pomegranate juice in celebration of the salvation of mankind. The festival was also linked to the flooding of the Nile, which every year would turn the color of blood as silt was carried upstream. Now, there are certainly some fascinating comparisons to be made there to the biblical text. Granted, there are also quite a few differences in the stories, so it's not like one just copied off of the other. But it is fascinating and a little mind-bending to consider how these two stories, the biblical one and the heavenly cow one, arose at roughly the same time. And if you think that's wild, wait until we talk about the tale of Ipuwer. Nogel says that laments the chaos that has engulfed Egypt and claims, quote, "The river is blood. If one drinks of it, one rejects it and thirsts for water. Foreign tribes have come to Egypt," end quote. Now here's the wild thing. As far as we can tell, it is almost certainly a couple of hundred years older than the earliest possible date of the Exodus. So that 1446 date that conservative scholars tend to take for the Exodus, this would have been at least 1 to 2, if not possibly 400 or 500 years before that happened. Not before it was written down, not before it was edited in and added into the final form as we know it in the Bible today, but before it would have even happened. Now, to be fair, there is not much to go on there. So it would not be right to say that the biblical authors copied ancient Egyptian mythology any more than it would be to say that the ancient Egyptian mythologies copied the Bible. That being said, it is a little weird and can be disorienting when you realize that the stories in the Bible are not always original ideas. In fact, the biblical authors frequently drew on the mythologies of the cultures around them, not directly copying or plagiarizing them, as some people online would like to say, but rather taking key themes and ideas and then often inverting them and subverting them to present them in a different way that puts Yahweh as the one true God. As Christians, we should not be scared of this. I understand, if you were taught a version of biblical transmission that basically has God just downloading the entire Bible into the mind of one author at a time who writes it down exactly and it is automatically in the same format that we have today, this sort of thing can be disorienting. But if we as Christians understand the living Word of God, Jesus, to be both human and divine, why is it such a stretch for us to understand God's written words as both human and divine? God didn't drop Jesus out of the sky fully formed at 30 years of age and ready to go into ministry. He grew up as a human in the culture of his day. He would have known popular songs of his time. He was influenced by the political events of his time. And he drew on and sometimes disagreed with the various philosophies of the people of his time. So why not also the Bible? Once you get past the initial shock to the fundamentalist system that this reality is, it shows itself to be rather sensible and consistent within the Bible itself. See, God doesn't just work within history, he reframes the stories of the cultures of the day, turning them on their heads and telling his own version of the story. Before we get any further, I want to pause again and acknowledge the difficulty of the violence in these texts. If you've been in church for any length of time, you're probably so familiar with the plagues narrative that it's easy to just gloss over this as something that, well, we just read it on the page and it doesn't really do that much for us. But try to put yourself in the shoes of the average Egyptian, maybe a baker, a farmer, or even just a parent trying to survive in the ancient world. You wake up thirsty, you go to your water source, and it's blood. Maybe you took your children with you, and now they're frightened. Your community is suddenly in crisis. You didn't personally order Hebrew babies to be killed, or probably didn't even take part in any of that. But you're experiencing the consequences of living within a system that did. This kind of psychological warfare is very intimidating and horrifying to innocents that get caught in the crossfires. It's easy to paint with very broad brushstrokes. Israel's the good guys, Egypt are the bad guys. But if you read the Bible for any length of time, you know that just because someone is the main character in a story doesn't mean that everything they do is good. In fact, it's often the quote unquote good guys in the story who behave badly, and it's the ones that we paint as outsiders who end up doing surprisingly redemptive things. Not every ancient Egyptian was a bad person, and particularly in a world where you didn't vote for your government leaders, they were even less complicit in what happened than we might be today in a government like we have in America. As Christians who believe in a loving God, we have to sit in the dissonance of a text like this, where God is willing to put innocence at risk in order to save other innocents. It's kind of a trolley dilemma here. And while we can argue over the ethics of which choice would be right for a human in the trolley dilemma, which, by the way, if you're not familiar with that, it's generally just an ethical experiment of if you have a trolley going down a track, you have one person on one track and you have three people on another track, and you're at the switch and you have to send the train down one of the tracks. Which way do you send it? And most of the time you would say in the one that does the least damage. So even though you are purposefully killing one person, you're also purposefully saving three others. And there's 1,000 different variations of that. But that hypothetical situation only works because we, as humans in that case, don't have the ability to stop the train ourselves. But if you are considering a powerful or even all-powerful God, who, given the trolley example, could just teleport the people off the tracks to safety or stop the train if he wanted to, or in the case of Egypt, punish those who were responsible only and save the innocents, well, things start to get a lot more messy then. And we can't just write it off by playing the mystery card. Oh, God's ways are higher than our ways and all that. Every time there's something difficult in Scripture, we can't just pull out that card to make everything make sense. It is not a get out of good theology free card. We have to wrestle with the fact that the same God that we call loving, forgiving, merciful, gracious, allowed horrible things to happen to innocent people in these stories. And there are no easy answers for that. I do think part of the reason it happens here, though, is because oppression had become so ingrained within the Egyptian system at that time that it was impossible to separate it out without there being some harm that happened. When structures that have organized entire civilizations begin to fall apart, ordinary people suffer. And we've kind of seen that happen a little bit here in America, as we've had to grapple in the last 100 years, and even less than that, the last 20 to 50 years, or, I mean, heck, even just go in the last 5 years, with a lot of the inherent racism and sexism and misogyny and all that that has been baked into our culture. We've seen a lot of overcorrections and overreactions as we try to find a new way forward. And it's really hard to heal a broken system that started off broken. We want faster change. We want things to be better, quicker, but it tends to go more slowly because if you try to change everything right away, a lot of innocent people get hurt. And that doesn't excuse the bad behavior of the past or the present, but it's just the reality that when you have a broken system that has been broken from the start, any change to it, and particularly fast change, is going to cause some collateral damage. And we see this happen in the text here, not just with innocent Egyptians, but also with innocent animals. The fish in the river die, according to verse 18. They didn't do anything wrong, and yet they are caught in the crossfires of the war between these gods. And when the text says that the river stank, that is the same word used from back in chapter 5, verse 21, when the Israelites said that their odor reeked in the eyes of the Egyptians after Moses first approached Pharaoh. Verse 19 has Aaron stretching his rod over the waters of Egypt, and it lists several different forms of water. streams, rivers, ponds, pools of water. What the King James has there as pools of water is a pretty rare word in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, it's only used 3 times in the entirety of the Tanakh. And it's the same word translated gathering together in the King James in Genesis 1:10. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. Same word there. Now, depending on your translation, verse 19 may end slightly differently. The King James reads that there will be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. But you'll notice, if you have the verse right in front of you, that vessels of is in italics in both of those cases. It literally just reads both in wood and in stone. So translators have had to wrestle with that and go, what does it mean for water to turn to blood in wood and stone? So the King James and some other translations say vessels. Some will even say bowls, wooden bowls and stone bowls. Robert Alter has a thought in his translation commentary I found quite helpful here. He writes, many construe this as a reference to wooden and stone vessels or receptacles, but the plural form etzim, that's the Hebrew word, suggests trees rather than wood. In any case, trees and stones as objects in nature accord better with the catalog of bodies of water that precedes than would household utensils. It has also been noted that the Hebrew pairing here, etzim wa avanim, is often used to refer to the material out of which idols are made. End quote. I love that observation. It's already suggesting a dig in at the gods of Egypt. And when verse 21 reads that the Egyptians could not drink of the water of the river, there's actually another verb in there that almost never gets translated over into English versions. It literally reads, the Egyptians couldn't bear to drink the water. So not just that they were physically unable to, but that they were also just repulsed by it. Again, the text is connecting the Egyptian response to the water to their earlier response to Israel. Liberation movements don't just challenge politics, they disrupt entire ways of life. And that is both necessary and genuinely difficult for everyone involved. We can celebrate God's solidarity with the oppressed while acknowledging the complex reality that systemic change often involves widespread disruption. As we get to the last few verses of the chapter, we see the return of Steve Martin and Martin Short. And if you understood that, you're probably a millennial. But, that actually brings up a point I forgot to mention last week. The text does not say that there were just 2 magicians in Pharaoh's court. In fact, what we read last week about the collection of multiple soothsayers and astrologers and lector priests suggests that this was a large crowd of magicians, of wizards, of sorcerers, whatever title you want to give them. Later tradition does focus on just 2, and they are called Jannes and Jambres. And if you can tell me which book of the Bible references their apocryphal names of Jannes and Jambres without looking it up, you get a gold star. Let me know in the comments if you remember which book of the Bible it is that references them by name. Either way, that comes from later tradition. And right now we have to finish up chapter 7. So let's look at verse 22. And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Neither did he listen to them, as Yahweh had said. And Pharaoh turned and went into his house. Neither did he set his heart to this also. And all the Egyptians digged round about the river for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the river. And 7 days were fulfilled, after that Yahweh had smitten the river. So yet again, the Egyptian sorcerers, through some unexplained connection to the supernatural realm, were able to match Moses' sign. And this forces us to consider a difficulty that's in the text here. Because up until verse 19, it sounded like just the Nile River was being affected. But in verse 19, when God lists the streams, the rivers, the ponds, the pools of water, and even the possibly vessels of wood and stone, depending on how you choose to translate that, that really makes it sound like all the water in Egypt had turned to blood. Like, not just the river, but let's say somebody was drinking a cup of water, well, all of a sudden that cup of water turned to blood too somehow. If that's the case, where did the sorcerers get fresh water to turn into blood as well? And to make this even more complex, just look at verse 24 again. The Egyptians digged round about the river for water to drink, and they couldn't drink of the water of the river. So the river was bloody, but it sounds like they were able to dig wells in other places that weren't so bloody. So we have verses 20 and 21 saying that there is blood all throughout Egypt, and then we have verses 22 and 24 suggesting that there was still water that hadn't been turned to blood. This is a good example of why, despite what so many preachers will say, all doesn't always mean all in the Bible. Sometimes the biblical authors used hyperbole just like we do when we speak. If I said every time I go to the store I run into someone I know, well, the chances are that is not true 100% of the time. I just mean that it happens a lot. The Bible frequently does that too, and that's okay. What the King James translates as enchantments in verse 22, the work of the magicians, it's literally secret knowledge. This was stuff that the average person wasn't supposed to know, spells and incantations. And yet Moses performed these acts, suggesting, at least from the perspective of the Egyptian sorcerers, that their secret knowledge had gotten out. Moses somehow knew stuff he wasn't supposed to know. And you can almost imagine how their minds must have been racing. Maybe he just read the right books when he was being raised in the palace. Nothing to worry about here. He's not doing anything too special. We can do this too, and we'll just prove that at best he's like one of us, but he's nothing better than us. Oh, how quickly that is about to change. And I can't help but wonder why the magicians didn't try to reverse the sign. If I were Pharaoh, I would be far less interested in the fact that you can also turn water to blood, and far more interested in finding someone who can turn blood into water. But that wasn't the main issue at hand. At this point, it's just about a show of power and validating magical prowess. Moses and Aaron are claiming to be more powerful than Pharaoh's lector priests, or at least representatives of a god more powerful than Pharaoh himself. The magicians are proving that they can do the same kind of thing. But by the third sign, they're starting to get a little nervous about how powerful Moses and Aaron are coming across, so they try to do something new. They try to reverse the third sign, but they can't. And by the fourth sign, they can't even stand, and they just remove themselves from the picture all along. So it's a natural progression as the narrative continues. The author of the text assumes that the sorcerers actually did the same sign as Moses, without feeling the need to explain exactly how they did it. We don't know how they created the same sign. And again, we don't even know where they got the pure water to do it. Humans can go for roughly about 3 days without water. But as we saw in the last verse, this lasts for a week. And I highly doubt that every single Egyptian household had a week's supply of water stored up in their houses. Or that the Egyptian government had water towers in every district to supply the townspeople during the bloody drought. So this suggests to me that it was not every bit of water in the entirety of the land that turned to blood. Verse 23 gives us a remarkably human detail that I can't help but snicker at. Pharaoh just simply goes home. He sees something he doesn't like, he walks away and shuts the door. The most powerful ruler in this part of the ancient world at this time responds to the challenge by retreating to a private space and pretending like it's not happening. There's something deeply recognizable and human about this response. So often, when our worldviews get challenged in ways we don't know how to handle, we just disengage. We close the laptop, we turn off the news, we withdraw from conversations that make us uncomfortable. I've known a lot of people in my life who aren't willing to be wrong, especially when it comes to what they believe about God, like Pharaoh here. Even when faced with truth right in front of them, they haven't taken the time to think outside their boundaries of what their group thinks about a particular issue. And so when they are confronted with something that suggests they could be wrong, rather than admitting that, they turn on their heels and just say, nope, you're wrong. No explanation why. I'm out of here. But as we'll learn with the next sign, walling yourself off in your own little safe bubble isn't quite as safe as you might think. Privilege often includes the luxury of avoiding uncomfortable realities, but God specializes in making avoidance impossible. Verse 25 suggests that this particular sign only lasted for 1 week, and that after the 7 days were up, the Nile went back to normal. Nothing in the text specifically states that this sign stopped, but that seems to be the implication, and it only makes sense since water continues to flow. But beyond that, did you notice the significance of the amount of time? God gave the Egyptians a week to get the picture. 7 days. Come on. We are talking about decreation happening, and God gives them a week after turning chaotic water into death rather than life. Just as God worked for 6 days at creation and rested on the seventh, so he works this sign of decreation for 6 days and offers rest on the seventh. Again, this is not just random ecological disaster. This is cosmic reordering. Egypt had inverted the order of creation by systemically dehumanizing people made in God's image. Now, God is methodically exposing how systems built on oppression are ultimately unsustainable. And I truly believe that the hope was that Pharaoh would have gotten the picture this time, that the other 9 signs would not be needed, that we could just proceed with one. God gave Egypt 7 full days to recognize that their entire civilization was built on foundations that couldn't hold. And like we pointed out last week, God keeps stating his intention with each of these signs. There is a purpose behind all the disruption. With this sign in verse 17, it was, "By this you will know that I am Yahweh." Next time we'll see, "So that you may know there is no one like Yahweh." That's chapter 8, verse 10. Chapter 8, verse 22, "So that you will know that I, Yahweh, am in this land." 9:14, "So that you will know that there is no one like me in all the land." 9:29, "So that you may know that the earth is Yahweh's." 10:1, "That you may know that I am Yahweh." 11:7, "You will know that Yahweh makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." This is fundamentally about raising consciousness, forcing recognition of realities that the people in power preferred to ignore. The entire worldview of ancient Egypt at this time was built on the assumption that Pharaoh was divine, that Egyptian dominance was natural and permanent, that Hebrew slavery was just the way things are. God systematically challenged every single one of these assumptions. And that ties in as well with our earlier mention of the Egyptian magicians' enchantments or secret knowledge, because some scholars have raised the question of how likely illiterate Hebrew slaves could have known about secret knowledge of ancient Egypt, particularly since these stories would have been written down long after the events themselves occurred. But the reality seems to be that Moses probably knew them. 40 years in Pharaoh's household would mean 40 years of access to the most classified information in the ancient world. Moses knew the ins and outs of the Egyptian system, the good and the bad. This was strategic positioning on God's part. And it raises an interesting question of how often God prepares the next generation of leaders by giving them inside knowledge of the systems that they will eventually challenge. And I don't just mean politically here. I think religiously as well. Growing up in fundamentalism, I remember so many times when leaders in churches would pray for God to send revival on our land, for God to break up the complacency and stir up a new generation of people who were willing to follow him at any cost, regardless of what other people said. And then came the deconstruction movement. I believe God answered the prayers of those leaders in those churches by raising up a generation of fundamentalists who looked at what they were taught and said, God isn't in this, and then left for something better. Many of those same leaders turned around and started blasting those people who had given their lives fundamentalism and evangelicalism as heretics or people who were never truly saved or weren't really serious about it to begin with. But that wasn't the case. I was one of those people. That was my whole life. I went to Bible college. I was in church every time the doors were open. And I was told, follow God no matter what anyone else says. And that's what we did. We followed him right out of the doors of those cold, dead churches at great cost to many of us. Deconstruction is the revival that fundamentalists and evangelicals prayed for. They just weren't ready for the way that God chose to answer their prayers. There's one other side tangent I want to bring up about these signs real fast, and it's that sometimes you'll run into some people who suggest that the signs could have been natural phenomena. For example, in this particular instance of the Nile turning to blood, they would suggest that maybe there were algae blooms that caused the water to turn red. and maybe that also made the water undrinkable. And then perhaps the ecological chain reactions from the quote unquote bloody water drove the frogs onto the land, and that's what caused the second plague. And that disrupted insect populations, which then led to the third and fourth plagues, which then led to disease outbreaks, which were the fifth and sixth, so forth and so on. While I do believe that God can and does use natural phenomena to work, these signs are specifically called miracles in the text. And to me, that suggests that God likely stepped in and did something supernatural, outside of the natural order. Now, could there be some connection, like bloody water sending frogs into the land, which allowed insect population to increase, which led to the disease later on? Yes, it is possible. But I don't usually build out those connections too much. I think they tend to get a little far fetched. And we don't have to have a natural explanation for everything that happened in the Bible. This was popular, I don't know, probably like 150-ish years ago when some people were trying to prove how every miracle in the Bible could have happened. I mean, going even as far as to say, like, when Jesus walked on the water, he somehow knew where there were rocky outcroppings that he could, like, step on shallow parts of the water and make it look like he was walking on water. That stuff to me just kind of misses the point of the story. The Bible is not some science textbook that is interested in explaining how the weird stories happen. The stories are weird for a reason. I will link to an article in the show notes here that suggests a possible explanation of natural phenomena for each of these plagues, just so that you can get an idea of how some people explain it. But I think it does go too far. And honestly, how these particular signs happened, I think is less important than asking, what are they teaching us about how God relates to systems of injustice? So, how do we deal with a story like this? What do we do with it? How do we process a God who disrupts entire civilizations to liberate oppressed people? Well, again, I think we need to start by acknowledging the genuine complexity here. The story doesn't fit neatly into black and white comfortable categories. It is simultaneously about divine justice and widespread suffering, liberation and ecological disaster, spiritual victory and human cost. These are ancient stories told in the language and worldview of their time. Rather than obsessing over every little historical detail, the better question is asking, what is the story trying to communicate about God's relationship to oppression and liberation? Because sometimes the most important truths about justice can only be told through stories that make us deeply uncomfortable without having any easy answers. Stories like this force us to consider when we're benefiting from oppressive structures. What would it look like for God today to challenge systems of economic inequality, environmental destruction, or racial injustice? Remember, we're not always Israel in the story. Sometimes we're more like Egypt. And the biblical authors frequently use shocking imagery and symbolic acts to wake people up to the realities they'd rather ignore. We see this happen all throughout the prophetic works as well. The blood in the water functions like prophetic street theater. It's meant to be disturbing. It's shock rock. It's memorable. It's transformative. It forces everyone involved to confront the human cost of systems that they'd previously taken for granted as just the way things are. Like I said at the start of the episode, if this was a movie, it would have an R rating. It would be getting nasty letters from moms in Focus on the Family groups complaining about how their children don't need to be exposed to this sort of thing. If this story were a song, it would have an explicit label on the album cover. If it were a piece of artwork, it would be at a 21 and older exhibition. But those are often the best works of art because they force us to come to grips with parts of ourselves that we don't consider in polite society. Prophetic actions aren't meant to be comfortable. They are meant to shatter complacency about injustice. And that is what God does all throughout the Bible. God's preferential favoritism of the poor and oppressed in Scripture becomes active resistance to established structures that keep those people under the thumb of people who have more than them. And again, I realize this is really uncomfortable to hear as modern Americans. It is really uncomfortable for me to hear as well. This Bible passage is making me feel uncomfortable and challenging my theology. I'll admit, I don't like it. Because as a relatively middle-class white American male, it means that I am probably closer to Pharaoh in this story than I am to Israel. And that leads me to meditate on the question, what would it look like to be in solidarity with God's liberation work rather than resistant to it, even if that means my established comfort gets upended? The God who disrupted Egypt's systems in the Bible is still disrupting systems today. The question is just whether we're participating on the side of empire or the oppressed. And think about what that reveals about divine power. God has the capacity to systematically dismantle civilizations built on injustice, but he usually works through human agents and natural processes rather than overwhelming supernatural force. And consider that in your life and in mine. We have delegated authority within our various systems: family, workplace, community, nation. How might God be calling you to use your sphere of influence in ways that challenge rather than perpetuate oppressive systems, even if we have benefited from them in the past? And that's what I'm sitting with here this week. Are there ways that we have become comfortable with injustice because it doesn't directly affect us? Are there systems that we've assumed are permanent, just the way things are, that might actually be more fragile and therefore more capable of change than they appear? Are there any blood in the water moments in our lives that could be signaling to us that we are on the wrong side and need to change focus? Because if the signs teach us anything, it's that God specializes in revealing that what looks unchangeable might actually be unsustainable. The God who turned water into blood is the same God who turns comfortable assumptions about power into uncomfortable questions about justice. And maybe the real tragedy in this story isn't what God did to Egypt, but how long the oppressive system of Egypt was allowed to continue before God had to step in and intervene. This isn't just ancient history, folks. It's a template for understanding how God continues to work in human societies even today, thousands of years later. The same divine commitment to liberation that challenged Pharaoh's system continues to challenge us today. The question for us then becomes, when we see God's liberating work happening in our time through social movements, activism, justice campaigns, do we recognize it as divine activity? Or do we, like Pharaoh, retreat back into our comfortable echo chambers and pretend like it's not happening? The plagues aren't just about what God did once. They're about what God is still doing wherever people are systematically dehumanized. And unfortunately, there is still a lot of that happening in the world today. Chapter 8 has signs 2, 3, and 4, so I kind of doubt we will get to all of them in one episode, but we will at least next time get into the second sign, when Egypt gets completely overrun by frogs, of all things. And if you think the blood in the water was complex, wait until you see what the amphibian invasion teaches us about ancient ideas of boundary-crossing creatures. But for now, we have some hard questions to sit with, and let's be careful not to rush to any easy answers. And most importantly, to remember that the God who liberates Israel is still liberating people today. And that can be both a comfort or a challenge. It all depends on which side you choose to be on. Until next week, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.